Harold Weatherby had been tending his roses when the sirens first pierced the morning quiet of Maple Street. At 78, his hearing wasn't what it used to be, but the approaching wail cut through his concentration like a blade through silk. He straightened slowly, his arthritic joints protesting after an hour bent over the flower beds, and watched 3 squad cars tear around the corner with lights flashing. The old man's weathered hands still clutched his pruning shears as the vehicle screeched to a halt 2 houses down. Mrs. Patterson's place. Harold had noticed the increasing number of visitors there lately, young men with hollow eyes and jittery movements who came and went at all hours. The neighborhood had been whispering about it for months. "Easy, boy," Harold murmured to the golden retriever that had materialized beside him, tail wagging uncertainly at the commotion. Rusty had appeared in Harold's life 3 years ago, a stray with matted fur and ribs showing through his coat. No amount of searching had turned up an owner, and Harold had stopped looking after the first month. The dog had filled a void in the widower's life that he hadn't even realized existed. The police officers were already surrounding Mrs. Patterson's house, their movements precise and coordinated. Harold had served in Vietnam and recognized the controlled urgency of men preparing for battle. His chest tightened with old familiar dread. Rusty began barking, not his usual friendly greeting, but something deeper, more primal. The dog's hackles rose as uniformed figures moved through their neighbor's yard. Harold reached down to steady his companion, feeling the animal's muscles tense beneath his palm. "It's all right," he whispered, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. The first shout came from Mrs. Patterson's backyard, followed by the sharp crack of splintering wood. More voices joined in, commands Harold couldn't quite make out over Rusty's increasingly agitated barking. The dog strained against Harold's gentle grip, every instinct telling him to investigate, to protect. Harold's own fence was low enough to see over, and he watched as officers flooded through Mrs. Patterson's property. One of them gestured toward Harold's yard, pointing and speaking rapidly into his radio. The old man felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning air. "Come on, Rusty," he said, turning toward his house. "Let's go inside." But the dog wouldn't move. Rusty stood rigid at the fence line, his bark becoming more insistent. Harold tugged gently at the collar he'd bought when it became clear the dog was staying. Still, Rusty refused to budge. The gate latch clicked behind them. Harold turned to see a young police officer entering his yard, hand resting on his service weapon. The man's face was flushed with adrenaline, his eyes darting between Harold and the still barking dog. "Sir, I need you to control your animal," the officer called out, his voice carrying an edge that made Harold's stomach drop. "He's harmless," Harold replied, raising his hands to show the pruning shears before setting them carefully on his garden table. "Just scared by all the noise." But Rusty had positioned himself between Harold and the approaching officer, his bark deepening into something that sounded less like fear and more like warning. The old man had never seen his gentle companion behave this way. More officers were coming through the gate now. 3, then 4. All young, all tense, all focused on the dog who refused to be silenced. "Sir, step away from the animal," another voice commanded. Harold looked down at Rusty. Loyal, loving Rusty, who slept at the foot of his bed and brought him his slippers every morning, and felt the world begin to shift beneath his feet. Time moved differently in moments of crisis. Harold had learned that in the jungles of Southeast Asia. He saw the young officer's hand move to his weapon with crystalline clarity, watched the other officers fan out across his carefully maintained yard, noticed how Rusty's golden coat caught the morning sunlight as the dog continued his protective stance. "Please," Harold said, his voice carrying decades of hard-earned wisdom about de-escalation. "Let me just put him inside. He's never bitten anyone. He's just scared." Officer Derek Morrison, his nameplate caught Harold's eye, kept his weapon holstered but his grip ready. At 26, Morrison had been on the force for 3 years, long enough to develop what his training called tactical awareness, but not long enough to distinguish between real threats and frightened animals defending their territory. "The dog needs to be secured now, sir," Morrison said, his training manual responses overriding his ability to see what Harold saw. a loyal pet protecting his elderly owner from perceived danger. Behind them, the raid on Mrs. Patterson's house intensified. Shouting, more breaking glass, the sound of furniture being overturned. Rusty's anxiety spiked with each crash, his barking becoming more frantic. Harold knelt slowly, ignoring the protests from his knees, and reached for his companion's collar. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, but his own hands were shaking now. "We're going to go inside just like we do every day." For a moment it seemed like it might work. Rusty's tail gave a tentative wag as Harold's familiar voice broke through his fear. The dog's muscles began to relax under his owner's gentle touch. Then Mrs. Patterson's back door exploded outward. A figure in dark clothing burst through, pursued by 2 officers. The fleeing suspect vaulted over the low fence separating the properties, landing hard in Harold's rose garden and crushing a month's worth of careful cultivation under his boots. Rusty's protective instincts overrode everything else. The dog lunged forward, not at the officers in Harold's yard, but toward the intruder who had destroyed his master's beloved flowers. His bark changed pitch, becoming the deep-chested warning of a dog defending his home. "Rusty, no!" Harold shouted, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Officer Morrison saw a large dog charging toward his fellow officers. His training kicked in: threat assessment, escalation protocols, protection of human life. His hand moved to his service weapon with practiced efficiency. "Get back," Morrison yelled, but whether he was addressing Harold or the dog was unclear. Harold lunged forward, his arthritic body moving faster than it had in years. His fingers brushed Rusty's collar just as the dog changed direction, no longer pursuing the fleeing suspect but simply trying to return to his master's side. The gunshot cracked across the morning air like a whip. Rusty's body jerked once, then crumpled onto the roses he had been trying to protect. The golden retriever's eyes found Harold's face, still trusting, still loving, even as the light began to fade from them. Harold felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, though that was shattered too, but something deeper, some fundamental faith in the order of things, in the basic decency that was supposed to govern how people treated each other and the innocent creatures in their care. The yard fell silent except for Harold's ragged breathing and the distant sound of sirens. The fleeing suspect had been tackled 3 houses down. Mrs. Patterson was being led away in handcuffs. The raid was over, but Rusty lay still among the roses, his blood seeping into the soil Harold had tended with such care. Officer Morrison holstered, his weapon, his hands trembling slightly. He was already formulating his report in his mind. Aggressive animal, threat to public safety, justified use of force. The words would protect him from disciplinary action and sleepless nights. Harold knelt beside his companion, his fingers finding the soft fur behind Rusty's ears where he had scratched him every morning for 3 years. The dog's tail gave one final, almost imperceptible wag. Then stillness. The crime scene tape went up around Harold's yard like a mockery of Christmas ribbon. Yellow plastic that transformed his sanctuary into something alien, something dangerous. He sat on his front porch steps, watching strangers in uniforms catalog the destruction of his world with the detached efficiency of people who had never loved anything enough to understand what they were measuring. Detective Sarah Chen had been assigned to the case, not because of Rusty's death, which was already being classified as a justifiable shooting in connection with the drug raid, but because of the growing crowd gathering on Maple Street. Word traveled fast in small neighborhoods, especially when it involved an elderly man and his dog. "Mr. Weatherby," Detective Chen said, approaching the porch with the careful respect she reserved for grieving family members. At 42, she had seen enough senseless loss to recognize the particular shade of grief that comes from sudden, violent endings. "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions." Harold's eyes remained fixed on the corner of his yard where Rusty had fallen. The body had been removed. Evidence, they called it. But Harold could still see the impression in the crushed roses, the dark stain that would never quite wash away. "He brought me my slippers every morning," Harold said quietly. "Never missed. A day in 3 years. Always the left one first, then the right one. Don't know why he did it that way, but he was consistent about it." Detective Chen pulled out her notebook. then thought better of it and sat down on the step beside the old man. The official questions could wait. "Tell me about him," she said instead. So Harold did. He talked about finding Rusty digging through his garbage cans on a cold November night, ribs showing through matted fur. About the month it took to coax the dog to trust him enough to come inside. About how Rusty would sit quietly beside his chair during the long evenings when the silence of the empty house became too much to bear. "My wife died 4 years ago," Harold said. "Cancer. Took 8 months, and I held her hand through every day of it. Thought I knew what losing someone meant, but this..." He gestured toward his yard, where neighbors continued to gather despite the police tape. "This is different." She had time to say goodbye. Rusty just looked at me like he was asking what he'd done wrong. Detective Chen had been taking notes after all, but not the kind that would go in her official report. Names of neighbors who had gathered, snippets of conversation that painted a picture of who Harold Weatherby really was. The man who shoveled Mrs. Chen's driveway without being asked, who had taught the Morrison boy down the street how to throw a curveball, who left packages of vegetables from his garden on doorsteps throughout the neighborhood. "The officer says the dog was aggressive," she said carefully. Harold's laugh was bitter. "Rusty once refused to come inside during a thunderstorm because there was a baby bird that had fallen from its nest by the back door. Sat there for hours, in the rain, making sure nothing happened to it. That's the kind of aggressive he was." By noon, the crowd had grown. Mrs. Patterson's arrest had been expected. The whole neighborhood knew about the drug activity. But the shooting of Harold's dog was something else entirely. Cell phone videos were already circulating, grainy footage of the moment when Officer Morrison drew his weapon, the terrible seconds that followed. Channel 7. News arrived first. Then, Channel 12. By evening, the story had been picked up by the regional networks. An elderly veteran, his beloved dog, a young officer who fired too quickly. The narrative wrote itself. Harold refused all interview requests. He sat on his porch as the sun set, watching strangers with cameras document his tragedy for public consumption. The police tape fluttered in the evening breeze like prayer flags marking a sacred site. "Mr. Weatherby?" A young reporter with perfectly styled hair and aggressive ambition approached the porch. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7. Our viewers would really like to hear your side of the story. Don't you want people to know the truth about what happened?" Harold looked at her for a long moment, taking in her expensive suit and calculating eyes. Behind her, a cameraman waited with equipment worth more than Harold's monthly pension. "The truth?" Harold said slowly. "The truth is that a good dog died for no reason. The truth is that some young man is going to have to live with that for the rest of his life. The truth is that my heart is broken and all your cameras and questions won't fix it." He stood up, his joints protesting after hours of sitting in the October chill. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go inside and figure out what to do with 3 years' worth of dog food." The reporter tried to follow, but Harold's front door closed with quiet finality, leaving her with nothing but empty footage and the growing murmur of neighbors who had heard enough. The story went viral sometime during the night. Harold woke to the sound of car doors slamming and discovered that Maple Street had been transformed into a media circus. News vans lined both sides of the narrow residential road, their satellites, reaching toward the sky like mechanical trees. Reporters clutched coffee cups and practiced their lead-ins while cameramen checked equipment and sound levels. Harold's phone had been ringing since 5 a.m. He'd stopped answering after the 7th call from news producers promising to tell his story with dignity and respect. The messages that followed grew increasingly desperate, offering money for exclusive interviews, threatening to run the story with or without his cooperation. At 8 o'clock, someone knocked on his front door with the particular persistence of people who believed their deadline was more important than his privacy. Harold ignored it. He sat at his kitchen table staring at Rusty's empty food bowl, trying to remember what normal mornings used to feel like. The knock came again, followed by a voice he didn't recognize. "Mr. Weatherby? I'm Tom Bradley from Good Morning America. We'd like to offer you an opportunity to share Rusty's story with the nation." Harold walked to his front window and peered through the curtains. The crowd had grown exponentially overnight. Neighbors stood in clusters, some holding homemade signs reading, "Justice for Rusty" and "Dogs aren't criminals." Children pressed flowers against his mailbox. Someone had left a stuffed golden retriever on his front step. His phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter in California. "Dad, I'm seeing you on the news. Are you okay? Call me." Then another from his son in Denver. "Flying out tonight. Don't talk to anyone until I get there." But the message that stopped him cold came from an unknown number. "My name is Derek Morrison. I'm the officer who shot your dog. Can we talk?" Harold stared at the screen for a long time. Through his window he could see the media frenzy growing by the hour. Satellite trucks were setting up for live broadcasts. A food truck had arrived to serve the reporters and protesters. His private tragedy was becoming public entertainment. Detective Chen had briefed him the night before about Officer Morrison. 26 years old, 3 years on the force, no prior incidents involving excessive force. A kid, really, though. Harold had been even younger when he'd carried an M16 through Vietnamese villages and made split-second decisions that haunted him still. He typed back, "My address, come alone." At 2 in the afternoon, a young man in civilian clothes approached Harold's house. The media pack descended on him like wolves, shoving microphones and cameras in his face, shouting questions about the shooting. Officer Morrison kept his head down and pushed through to Harold's front door. When Harold opened it, he saw his own grief reflected in the young man's eyes. "Mr. Weatherby," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." Harold stepped aside to let him in, and they sat in the living room where Rusty used to nap in the afternoon sunlight. Morrison's hands shook as he tried to find words for something that had no adequate explanation. "I've been a cop for 3 years, Morrison began. "Thought I knew how to handle situations like that. But everything happened so fast, and I saw your dog running toward my partners, and I reacted." Harold studied the young man's face. He saw genuine remorse there, the kind of pain that comes from knowing you can never undo what you've done. "Do you have a dog?" Harold asked. Morrison's face crumpled. "A chocolate lab named Max. He's 2 years old, sleeps on my bed every night." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I keep thinking about how I'd feel if it was Max instead of Rusty," Harold said gently. His name was Rusty. They sat in silence for several minutes, 2 men bound together by a moment that had changed both their lives forever. Outside, the media circus continued, but inside Harold's house, something more important was happening. "I don't know how to make this right," Morrison said finally. Harold looked at the empty corner where Rusty's bed used to be, at the leash still hanging by the back door, at all the small evidence of a life shared and now ended. "Neither do I, son," he said. "Neither do I." By the 3rd day, Harold's story had transcended local news to become a national conversation about police accountability, animal rights, and the vulnerability of elderly citizens. Cable news panels debated the incident with the clinical detachment of people who had never held a dying dog in their arms. Social media exploded with hashtags, "Justice for Rusty," "Defund the police," "Back the Blue." Harold's private grief had become a political football. The death threats started arriving that morning. Detective Chen delivered them personally, a manila folder thick with printed emails and social media screenshots. Some targeted Harold for being a cop-hating liberal. Others condemned him for accepting Officer Morrison's apology. The internet had decided that nuance was the enemy of justice, that Harold's refusal to demand Morrison's head made him complicit in his own dog's death. "We can provide protection," Detective Chen offered, setting the folder on Harold's kitchen table, "or help you relocate temporarily until this dies down." Harold flipped through the pages of venomous messages, each one a reminder of how his simple life had been transformed into something unrecognizable. People sure have strong opinions about things they weren't here to see. The media had camped permanently on Maple Street now. Neighbors were charging reporters for parking spaces and bathroom privileges. Mrs. Patterson's house, ground zero for the drug raid that had started everything, sat empty and forgotten while camera crews focused on Harold's modest home and The growing memorial of flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes covering his front yard. Officer Morrison had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. The police union had issued a statement supporting his actions. The district attorney was reviewing the case for possible charges. Everyone had an opinion about what should happen next, except the only person whose opinion truly mattered. Harold's phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed his daughter's number. "Dad, please." Linda's voice carried the strain of 3 sleepless nights. "Come stay with us in San Diego, just until this calms down." "This is my home," Harold said, looking out at his rose garden where crime scene technicians had trampled months of careful work. "Rusty's buried in the backyard. I can't just leave him." "Dad, they're showing your house on CNN. There are people calling you a traitor for talking to that cop. It's not safe." Harold understood his daughter's fear. At 78, he had become the unwilling center of a storm that threatened to consume everything in its path. The smart thing would be to flee, to let the media find someone else to feed their insatiable hunger for content. But running away had never been Harold's style. That evening, as the sun set behind the satellite trucks and portable lights, Harold made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. He walked out to his front porch where reporters had maintained a constant vigil and raised his hand for silence. The effect was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Camera operators scrambled to frame their shots. The dozens of people, scattered across his yard and the street beyond, turned toward him with the collective focus of an audience waiting for a performance. Harold looked out at the crowd, reporters seeking their next story, neighbors supporting him, protesters demanding justice, curious onlookers drawn by the spectacle, all of them waiting for him to say something that would fit their preconceived narratives about right and wrong, victim and perpetrator, justice and mercy. "I want to make a statement," Harold said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp October air. "But not here, not like this." He paused, gathering his thoughts while every word was recorded by dozens of devices. "Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I'll be at the police station. Anyone who wants to hear what I have to say can meet me there. But tonight, I'd appreciate it if you'd all go home and let an old man grieve in peace." The questions came in a rapid-fire burst. "Mr. Weatherby, what will you be asking for? Are you demanding Morrison's resignation? Will you be filing a lawsuit? Do you want the officer prosecuted?" Harold raised his hand again, and remarkably, they quieted. "You'll find out tomorrow," he said simply, then turned and walked back into his house, leaving behind a crowd buzzing with speculation about what the morning might bring. Inside, Harold sat in his empty living room and made a phone call. "Officer Morrison? This is Harold Weatherby. I need you to meet me somewhere. Tomorrow morning." The police station parking lot had been transformed into an amphitheater of anticipation. News crews occupied every available space, their equipment creating a maze of cables and light stands. Protesters held signs demanding justice while counter-protesters defended law enforcement. Local officials arrived in black sedans preparing for whatever Harold Weatherby was about to unleash. Harold walked slowly through the crowd, leaning heavily on the cane he rarely used but needed today. The weight of sleepless nights and crushing grief had aged him visibly in just 4 days. Beside him, Officer Derek Morrison walked with the measured steps of a man approaching his own judgment. The sight of them together sent ripples of confusion through the assembled crowd. This wasn't the narrative anyone had expected. Victim and perpetrator side by side, united in some purpose no one could yet understand. Chief of Police Margaret Torres had arranged for a small podium to be set up on the station steps. As Harold approached, she offered him her arm for support, but he declined with a gentle shake of his head. He needed to do this under his own power. The crowd fell silent as Harold reached the microphone. Camera shutters clicked like mechanical rain. Somewhere in the mass of people, his children watched via live stream, having flown in too late to stop him, but in time to witness whatever he was about to do. Harold looked out at the sea of faces. Reporters hungry for content, neighbors offering silent support, strangers drawn by the magnetic pull of tragedy transformed into spectacle. He thought about Rusty, about the quiet mornings when his biggest Concern was whether the roses would survive the first frost. "My name is Harold Weatherby," he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "4 days ago, Officer Derek Morrison shot and killed my dog Rusty in my backyard. That's why you're all here. That's the story you want to tell." He paused, gathering himself for what came next. "But I want to tell you a different story. About a young man who made a terrible mistake and has to live with it for the rest of his life. About neighbors who brought casseroles and flowers when they could have brought anger. About a community that came together instead of falling apart." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the call for justice they'd expected. "I served in Vietnam," Harold continued. "I know what it's like to make split-second decisions in impossible situations. I know what it's like to carry the weight of choices you can't undo. Officer Morrison was doing his job, trying to protect people, when everything went wrong in ways no training could have prepared him for." Officer Morrison stood beside the podium, tears streaming down his face as Harold's words washed over him like absolution. "Rusty was a good dog, the best dog. He deserved better than what happened to him, and I'll miss him every day for the rest of my life. But destroying this young man's life won't bring Rusty back. It won't make any of us safer. It won't make any of this make sense." Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Officer Morrison has offered to resign from the police force. He's offered to pay for Rusty's burial and make donations to animal shelters in his memory. He's offered to do whatever he thinks might help heal the damage he's caused." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "I've told him I don't want any of that. What I want is for him to stay on the force. I want him to remember this day, this feeling, this weight he's carrying. I want him to use it to become the kind of officer who sees dogs as companions, not threats, who sees elderly men as grandfathers, not obstacles, who understands that split-second decisions can echo through entire lifetimes." Harold folded the paper and looked directly at Officer Morrison. "I forgive you, son. Not because what happened was okay, it wasn't. Not because Rusty's life didn't matter, it did. But because forgiveness is the only thing that can stop this pain from spreading like cancer through our community." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of people crying. In the crowd, hardened reporters wiped their eyes. Protesters lowered their signs. Police officers stood at attention, many of them thinking about their own pets waiting at home. Officer Morrison stepped forward to the microphone, his voice barely audible. "Mr. Weatherby has given me a gift I don't deserve," he said. "I promise to spend every day of my career trying to earn it. Rusty's death will not be meaningless if it makes me a better officer, a better man." Harold took the microphone one last time. "We can choose to let this tragedy divide us, or we can choose to let it teach us. We can demand blood for blood, or we can demand something harder, that we all do better, that we see each other as human beings capable of both terrible mistakes and incredible grace." He looked out at the crowd one final time. "I'm going home now to plant new roses where my old ones were trampled. Officer Morrison has offered to help, and I've accepted. Anyone who wants to build something instead of tearing it down is welcome to join us." Harold stepped away from the podium and walked slowly back through the crowd. Behind him, Officer Morrison followed, carrying the weight of forgiveness like a sacred trust. By evening, the news trucks were gone. The protesters had dispersed. Maple Street was quiet again, except for the sound of neighbors working in Harold's garden, planting new roses in soil nourished by tears and watered by grace. The story that went viral this time was different. It wasn't about division or blame or the perfect soundbite for the evening news. It was about an old man who chose love over hatred, healing over revenge, and in doing so, reminded the world that even in our darkest moments, we remain capable of choosing light. Rusty's memorial garden bloomed that spring, tended by an unlikely partnership between an elderly veteran and a young police officer who had learned that the heaviest burdens become lighter when carried together. And somewhere in the space between loss and forgiveness, between tragedy and grace, they both found a way to honor the memory of a good dog who had brought them together in the most unexpected way.